A thin metal cable slipped into a hole in the frozen ground, and the story that grew around it was almost too dark to forget. People said Soviet scientists had lowered a microphone nearly 12 kilometers into the earth and heard human screams rising from the deep. That legend would spread across churches, tabloids, late-night radio, and the early internet, turning one remote drilling site into one of the most feared places on Earth. But the real beginning was quieter, colder, and in some ways more unsettling, because this story was never really about hell. It was about people trying to force their way into a world beneath their feet that they did not understand, and finding out, meter by meter, how small they really were. If stories like this pull you in, subscribe now, because the darkest real histories are often the ones buried deepest. The truth began on May 24, 1970, on the Kola Peninsula in the far northwest of the Soviet Union, close to the borders of Norway and Finland, where Soviet scientists started drilling what became the Kola Superdeep Borehole. It was part of a wider scientific push during the Cold War, when the superpowers were proving what their systems could do. And while the United States looked upward into space, Soviet researchers also chose the opposite direction. They wanted to drill down into the Earth's crust, not for oil, not for gas, but for knowledge itself. They chose that part of the world for a reason. The Kola Peninsula sits on the Baltic Shield, a vast mass of ancient rock that has been stable for an almost unimaginable span of time. If you wanted to cut into old continental crust and read the deep history of the planet directly from the stone, this was one of the best places on Earth to try. The plan was huge for its time. The Soviet team hoped to reach 15 kilometers, a depth no one had ever reached. The hole would be narrow, just enough for the drill and instruments, but what it represented was much bigger than its width. It was a scientific experiment, a prestige project, and a test of will all at once. In public, it looked like reason and patience. Underneath that, it carried something older and more emotional, the need to push past a boundary simply because it was there. That urge had a kind of wound inside it. For centuries, people had walked on the earth and built on it, mined it, mapped it, named it, and still had almost no direct contact with what lay far below the crust. Scientists had models, seismic readings, lab tests, and smart guesses, but much of deep geology was still an argument held above ground. The deeper layers of the planet existed in charts and theories more than in human experience. Kola was meant to change that. It was meant to cut through abstraction and touch the real thing. That was the dream behind it, a clean line downward, hard facts pulled from darkness, a direct answer from the earth itself. But dreams like that carry their own danger. When people stop seeing the unknown as something to respect and start seeing it as something to defeat, the story usually changes. It just takes time before anyone admits it. The drilling itself was slow, technical, and punishing from the start. Early work used a Uralmash 4E rig, later followed by the more powerful Uralmash 15,000, built for the new target depth. Nothing about the job was glamorous. There was no dramatic crater, no giant opening in the ground, no visual proof that matched the scale of the ambition. The borehole was small in width, almost humble-looking, but the effort around it was enormous. Crews worked in a harsh northern landscape, in a facility built for a task that had never been done before. The deeper the drill went, the more every meter became its own fight. Heat had to be managed, pressure had to be handled, instruments had to survive conditions that they were never fully comfortable. And still the work continued, because each new depth meant more than technical success. It meant the Earth was giving something back. For a while, the project looked like a steady rise. Soviet geologists and engineers pushed deeper through ancient rock, bringing up core samples that carried pieces of a buried world. The borehole kept advancing, and with each gain, the project seemed to justify itself. In 1979, Kola passed the Bertha Rogers Hole in Oklahoma and became the deepest borehole on Earth. That was not a small milestone. It turned the site into a world record, a symbol of Soviet scientific reach and proof that the dream was still alive. Beneath the cold routines of drilling reports and technical updates, there was real momentum now. Kola had become more than a research site. It was a statement. It said human beings could break through limits that had once looked fixed. It said the crust was no longer just a shell imagined from above. It could be entered, measured, challenged. But there was always another side to that rise. Progress on paper did not mean the Earth was cooperating. Even before the most famous setbacks came, small signs were already pointing in a different direction. Heat deep underground was rising faster than many had expected. The deeper rock was not behaving like the simple, obedient material people often picture when they think of drilling. Under pressure and temperature, it could shift in ways that made the hole harder to control. This was the first real crack in the story. The project had been built on the idea that the Earth could be studied through deeper access. That part was true. What was beginning to fail was the calmer assumption hidden under it, the belief that the Earth would stay still long enough to let itself be read. The science coming back from Kola made that tension even stronger. Seismic studies had led many geologists to expect a clearer boundary between rock types deeper down, including a shift they believed would mark the change from granite to basalt. Kola complicated that picture. The neat boundary many expected was not appearing in the way they had predicted. Instead of confirming an old map, the borehole was starting to expose how much of that map had been built from indirect readings that could mislead even good scientists. That kind of discovery is exciting when it first arrives. It feels like progress. It feels like the world getting larger. But there is something darker inside it, too. When your best models fail, you do not just gain new facts, you lose confidence in the ground under the old ones. Kola kept doing that. It kept returning surprises that made the Earth look older, stranger, and less tidy than many researchers expected. Scientists found evidence of deep fractures, gases, and water at depths where such things were not widely expected in the old picture. They also found microscopic fossils in ancient rock, traces of life preserved far below where many people would imagine anything biological could endure. These were not horror movie discoveries. They were real scientific findings. Yet they carried their own eeriness. The deeper the hole went, the less empty the crust seemed. It was not a clean stack of simple layers. It was a history under pressure, a place where old assumptions bent and broke. This is why the project matters more than the legend that later swallowed it. The true story was already full of tension before anyone added fake screams. At Kola, every success came tied to a warning. A deeper record also meant deeper strain. Better samples also meant stranger questions. Each new achievement made the project more famous, but it also made the limits more visible. Human beings had built a machine to go downward, and the machine was working. That much was real. What was becoming harder to say out loud was that the farther it traveled, the less the old human confidence seemed to fit the place it had entered. By the early 1980s, the borehole had pushed well past 10 kilometers. That number alone is hard to hold in your mind. 10 kilometers through rock is not just distance, it is pressure, heat, time, and weight layered on top of one another until ordinary language starts to fail. The hole was still narrow. The men working there still stood on the surface. The machinery still turned, lowered, measured, and pulled. Yet the project had already crossed into a zone where simple drilling became something closer to negotiation with the planet itself. And still, there was pride. There had to be. A project like this could not survive without belief. Kola stood as a rare thing in the Soviet scientific world, a site where long patience could produce prestige. The world record mattered. The findings mattered. The ambition mattered. A place that looked empty and severe on a map had become one of the most important windows into the deep crust anywhere on Earth. For researchers, that meant discovery. For the Soviet state, it meant proof. For everyone involved, it meant that years of labor in a remote northern outpost had become part of something larger than themselves. That sense of rise is important because it explains why the warning signs did not stop the movement. When a project starts delivering glory and knowledge at the same time, it becomes much harder to slow down. Yet the hidden cracks kept widening. The deeper conditions were harsher than the planners had wanted to believe. At extreme depths, the rock was hotter, softer in behavior, and more difficult than expected. Drill tools faced stress that built up over time. The hole itself had to be managed with incredible care. This was no straight, easy descent into stable stone. Every added kilometer made the next one more uncertain. Even success carried a threat inside it because it pushed the entire system closer to forces it could not fully master. The Earth was not waiting at the bottom like an answer sheet. It was changing the rules as they went. Something is haunting about that stage of the story because it still looked calm from the outside. No disaster had yet defined the project, nor had legend twisted it into a tale of damnation. The men at Kola were still working. The rigs were still turning. The reports were still being written. The rise had not ended. And that is exactly why this part matters. This is where the story becomes human. People are easiest to understand when they are climbing and still believe the climb makes sense. Kola was strongest at the moment when it had every reason to trust itself and quiet reasons to doubt. That is the moment where history often hides its real turning point, long before the fall becomes obvious. By 1982, one of the main boreholes had reached 11,662 meters. The achievement was massive. It proved the effort was not a stunt and not a fantasy. It was one of the boldest drilling projects ever attempted, and it was still moving. Yet every gain was forcing the team into a harder truth. The deeper they drilled, the more the Earth resisted the neat version of itself that science had expected to find. The borehole was opening rock, but it was also opening uncertainty. And so the first part of the story ends in that uneasy place, with the record still standing, the ambition still alive, and the silence below growing heavier. On the surface, Kola looked like a Soviet triumph carved into the Arctic ground. Beneath the surface, the pressure was building, the temperatures were rising, and the deep crust was beginning to answer in ways no one had planned for. Once the drill pushed beyond 12,000 meters, the question was no longer whether they could make history. They already had. The real question was what history was about to do back to them. By 1984, the drill had already gone farther than anyone had once thought possible, and that was exactly when the ground beneath the project began to give way in a new sense. Deep in the borehole, after years of work and thousands of meters of progress, a large section of the drill string twisted off and was lost. It happened far below the surface, in darkness no person would ever see, but the damage reached all the way back up to the men running the site. A break like that was more than a technical problem. It meant time lost, money lost, effort buried, and a painful admission that depth itself was turning against them. The hole was still there, but the path they had forced into the earth had been damaged in a place they could not simply reach down and repair. They had to step back, drill again from higher up, and create a new branch. In a project built on going forward, that kind of reversal carried its own humiliation. Still, they kept going, because by then the work had become too big to abandon easily. Kola was no longer just a scientific job in a remote northern outpost. It was a record, a symbol, and for the people there, a kind of stubborn promise that all those years in the cold had to mean something. So they started again and pushed downward once more. But the deeper the new branch went, the more the Earth stopped behaving like a stable object and started acting like a force. Temperatures rose far beyond early expectations. Instead of the lower numbers planners had once hoped for, the rock down there was reaching around 180 degrees Celsius. At that heat, the whole effort changed. Metal weakened, drilling tools wore down faster. The rock itself became less predictable under the pressure. It could deform, squeeze, and fight the shape of the hole. The deeper they forced their machines, the less the planet felt like something fixed and solid. It felt alive in the only way rock can feel alive, by moving slowly enough to crush certainty. And yet, the same depths that punished them also kept giving them reasons to stay. That was part of the trap. Kola was still producing discoveries that mattered. Scientists had expected one picture of the deep crust and were getting another. The clean change many thought they would find between granite and basalt was not showing up the way older models suggested. Water appeared much deeper than many had expected, trapped in fractured rock and driven by pressure. Ancient microfossils turned up in rocks more than 2 billion years old. The project was breaking equipment, but it was also breaking assumptions. Every new surprise made the borehole harder to quit, because stopping would mean walking away just as the Earth was finally revealing how strange it really was. That is what made the pressure personal. The crews were not just fighting heat and machinery anymore. They were caught between warning signs and discovery, between the fact that the hole was becoming harder to control and the feeling that the next few hundred meters might answer questions geologists had argued over for decades. This is where the story grows heavier. A project can survive difficulty when people believe the suffering still leads somewhere. Kola still had that belief, but belief under strain starts to harden into something else. It turns into endurance for its own sake. It turns into refusal. It turns into a mood where stopping feels more painful than failing slowly. By the late 1980s, that mood was everywhere in the project. The site had become a place where achievement and damage existed side by side. On paper, they were still making history. In practice, every meter cost more than the last. Then came 1989. The borehole reached its deepest point, 12,262 meters. It was the deepest point humanity had ever drilled into the Earth.
The numbers sounded like triumph, and in one sense it was. A narrow shaft in the Arctic had gone deeper than any mine, deeper than any earlier borehole, deeper than the imagination of earlier generations had seriously expected. But that record was also a wall. They had reached the place where the project's great ambition met the full force of its limits. The heat was too intense. The tools were under too much stress. The rock itself would not give them the kind of clean passage they needed. Kola had won its place in history at the very moment it was running out of future. That is the kind of moment that hurts more than open failure. Failure at least arrives honestly. This was worse. They had done something extraordinary, and still it was not enough to get where they had wanted to go. The original goal had been 15 kilometers. They never got close to that final target. They had reached farther than anyone else and still fallen short inside their own story. Around the same time, the world above the borehole was changing fast. The Soviet Union was weakening. Money grew tighter. Priorities shifted. A project like Kola had always depended on more than science. It needed state support, political will, institutional patience, and a system capable of funding long, difficult work with no quick reward. Once that larger structure began to crack, the borehole felt it too. The slowdown was not dramatic in the way a disaster is dramatic. It was more painful than that. It was a draining away of momentum. The great machine was still there. The record still stood. The samples still mattered. But the force that had carried the project through years of strain was thinning out. This is also the point where the myth began to gather real power. As the project stalled and public understanding faded, a darker story started moving outward. It claimed that Soviet scientists had lowered a microphone into the hole and recorded the screams of people in torment below the Earth. The details shifted depending on who told it. Sometimes the location changed, sometimes the depth changed, sometimes the source sounded like a frightened engineer, sometimes like a pastor repeating secret evidence from behind the Iron Curtain. But the core stayed the same. People wanted to believe that the deepest hole on Earth had uncovered something more than geology. They wanted punishment, mystery, a warning against going too far. The legend was false, but it spread because it attached itself to something real, the mood around Kola. The place already felt eerie enough to carry it. A remote Soviet site, a hole deeper than any other, instruments listening to the Earth from far below, and a project falling apart under pressure. Once those pieces existed, fiction did not need much help. The sad part is that the myth began to outlive the work itself. The public memory of Kola started drifting away from what had actually happened there. The science, the years of labor, the broken tools, the ruined expectations, the deep fossils, the trapped water, the heat that bent the whole project toward its stopping point. All of that was slowly pushed aside by a better horror story. And maybe that was its own kind of loss. The people at Kola had spent years trying to pull truth out of the ground, and in the end, the world preferred a lie. By the early 1990s, the project was fading with the country that had driven it. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Funding became harder to justify. The dream of driving ever deeper into the crust no longer matched the political and economic reality closing in around the site. What remained was a world record, an exhausted project, and a place where ambition had hit a limit no speech could hide. The fall was slow enough to feel cruel. Kola did not explode into legend because of one final dramatic event underground. It wore down. It lost support. It became harder to continue and easier to neglect. That kind of ending leaves a different wound. It leaves the feeling of something unfinished, something that did not die in one clean moment, but weakened until the silence around it became permanent. And that is where the second part of the story closes, with the deepest hole on earth still open, the truth already slipping out of public memory, and the people who had chased the center of the crust left facing an emptiness they could not drill through. The record remained. The dream did not. What followed was not resolution. It was abandonment, myth, and a truth so much quieter than the legend that most people stopped listening before they ever heard it.
What came after all that effort was smaller than the dream and heavier than the legend. The site faded into the Arctic cold. Buildings aged. Equipment sat still. The deepest hole ever drilled by human hands was eventually sealed beneath a metal cap, and the place that had once carried the weight of Soviet science was left with rust, silence, and a record that felt almost lonely. That is the part people usually do not picture. They imagine some final revelation, some last descent, some hidden discovery too terrible to release. The real ending was harder in a different way. It was unfinished. It was human. A project built to break through the earth, hit the limit of heat, pressure, money, and time, then slowly slipped out of the center of history. What remained was not triumph and not some supernatural punishment. What remained was a scar in the ground and a question about why people always want the unknown to speak in a human voice. That is why the legend lasted. The story about the microphone and the screams spread because it gave the whole a simple meaning. It turned geology into terror. It turned a remote Soviet research site into a warning story. But the truth is plainer and in some ways more disturbing. There is no verified evidence that scientists at Kola recorded voices from below. The famous sounds tied to the well-to-hell story were a hoax. The details never matched the real project. The borehole was on the Kola Peninsula, not in Siberia. Its deepest point was 12,262 meters, reached in 1989. The men there did not uncover hell. They uncovered evidence that the Earth was hotter, stranger, and more complicated than they had expected. They found that old models of the deep crust were too simple. They found water where many did not expect it, gases moving through rock, and traces of ancient life preserved in stone more than 2 billion years old. Those findings were real. They were harder to explain at a glance, and maybe that is why so many people looked past them. A scream is easier to remember than a scientific correction. A myth travels faster than a careful truth. That happens in history more often than people like to admit. The loudest version is not always the real one. The most popular ending is not always the honest one. Kola shows that clearly. A place built to gather facts became famous for a lie. Years of patient work were buried under one invented horror story. And that says something painful about the way people face the unknown. We do not just fear what we cannot see. We reshape it into something dramatic enough to carry our fear for us. In that way, the myth was never really about the whole.